Thank you for joining. The webinar will begin in a few moments. Thank you for joining. The webinar will begin in 1 minute.
Welcome, everyone, and welcome to the expert webinar series, Diversity and Bias Thinking. And I want to start off, so I'm Jeff Kitchens. I'm with the co-chair of the Inclusive Innovation Initiative, which is a sort of a grassroots effort and organization here in Bend, Oregon, that has started a process of trying to bridge the gaps and the connections and the communications between a number of efforts related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the city of Bend in Central Oregon. It's a new organization. We have a relatively new Facebook page, it's been around for a couple of years, and also recently put out a toolkit for recruitment, hiring, and retention focused on DEI employers in Central Oregon, but obviously a tool that you can use anywhere. So just want to do a quick introduction to myself and welcome everybody. So on behalf of the Chamber, the Bend Young Professionals, and the Inclusive Innovation Initiative, welcome to Diversity and Bias Thinking. I wanted to start out by saying that today is an incredible opportunity to hear perspectives, to learn about ourselves, and to just listen. We understand, all of us that are a part of this, and I'm sure many of you on the listening in today, that this is not an easy time. A lot of folks are hurting. A lot of folks are talking about change. By just participating in this event, in terms of the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you are helping move that dial. For the next 90 minutes, we have this great opportunity to learn. And as part of this, we're going to ask everybody to be respectful and civil. And that includes your comments and your questions. Again, I cannot tell you how awesome it is that you all are participating. We have hundreds of participants today, and it's pretty awesome, pretty amazing. And so thank you. Thank you for caring. Thank you for wanting to learn, and thank you for being a part of this. Today's program, following this brief introduction, will be an amazing training by Erica McAlpin, who I will introduce in just a second. And then following that, we have an equally awesome opportunity of a Q&A with Erica and Marcus LeGrand and Anissa Bohannon. And I'll be introducing Marcus and Anissa a little bit later after Erica's presentation. So let me start off by introducing Erica and then letting her get into her training, because you certainly didn't sign on to hear me talk today. Erica McAlpin is a business instructor and degree program lead at OSU Cascades, who engages equity and inclusion work in her courses and in the community. She heads the Love Your Neighbor forums in Central Oregon. At Oregon State University, Erica was awarded the Francis Dancy Hooks Award for building bridges across cultures, showing courage in promoting diversity and proudly walking the talk. Please let me welcome Erica McAlpin to start her wonderful training. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for that kind introduction. And thank you all for joining us today. It is so important at this time in history to be a part, to learn, and to grow. And I am just thankful that you all have decided to join this training and learn and grow together today. So thank you. I'll be talking to you for the next 55 minutes about implicit bias. And before I get started, I want to explain that even though I express a lot of views, I talk a lot in the community and do a lot of education around these topics in the community, I am not the Black representative. I am not the voice of all Black people. So make sure you engage in dialogue with other folks, other people of color, to get their perspectives as well. I was asked the question just last week at another event that I took part in about being called a Black woman versus an African-American woman. And it just goes to show the difference in perspective among different people of color, because I choose to be called a Black woman because I think that people from Africa that have come to America and gained citizenship are African-American people, just like we have Mexican-Americans or Asian Americans. I'm a Black American. I was born here in the United States. And I just consider myself that versus African-American. However, I encourage you to have that dialogue with other people to determine what they would like to be called or how they would like to be addressed. Although I do just prefer Erica because that's much simpler. So let's dive into making the unconscious conscious today. So the plan of action, I'm going to review some common equity terms with you, and we will discuss the reality of implicit bias. So many people don't think that bias is real. So I'm going to show you some examples of implicit bias in some of the systems that we've established here in our country. We'll define it and explain how it's developed and why our brains tend to do what they do in terms of categorizing people. We'll discuss how implicit bias impacts employment practices and what can be done to mitigate them. We'll work through the case studies that you were provided when you registered, and hopefully we will leave with a better understanding of implicit bias, how it manifests itself, and how it can be mitigated in your personal life as well as in your organization. So this is a brief glossary. Please do not think that these are all the words that make up the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. This is just a few. And I wanted to cover some that really relate to what is happening in our country right now. So being an ally, many of you are here today because you are allies or you want to be allies to the cause that Black, Indigenous people of color face. So you will hear me use that term, Black, Indigenous people of color, or BIPOCs today. As someone who supports a group other than your own, an ally acknowledges oppression and actively commits to reducing their own complicity, investing in building their own knowledge and awareness. So you're here today, that's what you're doing. You are trying to build your own knowledge and awareness as it relates to these social issues. Bias is what we're talking about today, a form of prejudice that results from our tendency and needs to classify individuals into categories. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. Being colorblind, I've often heard, especially here living in Central Oregon, I've heard a lot, I don't see color. I was raised to not see color. Well, not seeing my color, A, unless you're visually impaired, yes, you do see it. And B, that erases my identity when you say you don't see my color, because being Black is a part of my identity. So saying that you're colorblind erases that person's identity and conversation. So please don't do that, or try not to do that. Cultural appropriation. So around Halloween, you may see posts on Facebook where people say, my culture is not your costume. When we dress up, or people dress up as Indigenous peoples, Native Americans, common terms, Indians, you know, when people dress up that way, and we have controversy in the news even around sports teams like the Washington Redskins, that's cultural appropriation. That's taking on someone's culture. And it's offensive in that that's a part of their heritage and who they are. Equity is the fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all people, while at the same time striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented full participation of some groups. And I'll show you a graphic in just a minute that really shows the difference between equality, equity, and liberation or justice. Inclusion, making all people feel welcome, respected, supported, and valued as a fully participating member of society. We are still working very hard on inclusion and making sure that everyone has a seat at the table, that their voice is heard. We still have a lot of work to do in that area. Privilege. So privilege is a common trigger word. It's exclusive access or availability to material and immaterial resources based on the membership to a dominant social group. Now, I'm surprised I didn't change that definition, because I hate to say the word dominant or dominant culture. I say the majority, because I don't believe that anyone is going to dominate me. So I just prefer to say the majority social group. However, I will say that privilege can exist among people that are, it exists just in society, privilege does. I have privilege, being an educated Black woman versus someone that's not. So it gives me access to other resources. My education may give me access to certain, in certain places that other people may not have. And white privilege is a real thing. And just being white can afford you a safe encounter with police. If you don't believe me, you can just Google white men taking guns from police, and you'll see many, or fighting with police, and you will see many videos that show that there's a very different reaction to white men that do just exactly what Rashard Brooks did in Atlanta a few days ago. So privilege is real, it exists. Social justice. It constitutes a form of activism based on principles of equity and inclusion that encompasses a vision of society in which the distribution of resources is equitable and all members are physically and psychologically safe and secure. So social justice initiatives are happening all over the country. They have been. Oregon State University, where I work, has a social justice education initiative where a person trains all of the faculty and staff that want to be around social justice issues. Systemic, institutional, and structural racism. So you've probably heard these terms a lot in talking about what's going on in the country right now. It's a form of racism that is expressed in social and political systems. It can lead to issues of discrimination in criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, and political power. And I will talk more about systemic racism as we go on today. So I mentioned this graphic that shows equality, equity, and liberation. And if you're familiar at all with equity work or social justice work, you've probably seen this graphic, or even in HR trainings that your employer may do. But you see here that equality exists when everyone has the same resources. But you see that not everyone is benefiting from equality, because the shortest person at the fence still can't see, and the tallest person doesn't necessarily need the resource. So equality still doesn't get to justice or liberation. Equity is providing the most resources to the person that needs them the most. So you see that the shortest person has the most resources and can now see the baseball game. Liberation is just when the barrier, which is the fence, is removed, and we all have justice when that occurs. And that is what we are working so hard to establish in America, because there are so many fences that are up, that are barriers to education, to healthcare, for Black, Indigenous people of color. So an example of how bias exists in the criminal justice system. You all may recall these cases when they happened. However, I'm going to compare the story, and these are real situations that happened, that you can Google at a later date to get these facts. But Brian Banks is an African-American man. He was 17 years old at the time that he was accused of rape by a 16-year-old girl. He was arrested, and because his family was poor, he did not have the resources to hire his own attorney. He had a public defender. And when that public defender told him that he was faced with a 41-year prison sentence for being accused of rape, he accepted a plea deal of 5 years in prison, 5 years probation, and being registered as a sex offender. Later, after he had served a few years in prison, the accuser recanted their story, and Banks was released from prison. At the time, he was a high school senior, had already agreed to go to USC to play football, was on track to go to the NFL. After he was released from prison, he was able to play in the NFL for a few years. His story worked out eventually, but he did have to serve time in prison for a crime that he did not commit. Brock Turner, on the other hand, a 19-year-old white college student at Stanford, was seen raping a 22-year-old unconscious woman. He was stopped by two men that were riding by on bikes. He attempted to run from them, but they chased him and tackled him and held him until the police came. He was charged with 5 felony counts, but Brock was different. He had very different circumstances than Brian Banks, in that he was wealthy, with wealthy parents, and he was able to hire his own attorney. He was released on $150,000 bail. Eventually, after his trial, during his trial, he was convicted of 3 charges of felony sexual assault and was sentenced to 6 months in county jail. He didn't even serve all of the 6-month sentence. I believe he served like 3 months of that 6-month sentence. So you can think that bias doesn't exist in the prison system or the criminal justice system, but it does. And just think about what Brian Banks's life would have been like had the woman not recanted her story. And you can Google this to find out what happened to her, but she did suffer some consequences as a result of lying, basically. But we see in the news so many times where women lie or call the police when there's not a reason for the police to be there, and the outcome is often bad for men of color. So, what is implicit bias? It's unconscious, unintentional bias. Bias is defined as a personal and sometimes unreasoned judgment. Biases can have a tendency to allow differences such as age, race, and sex to affect the appraisal of job candidates. Everyone possesses implicit biases, even people with commitments to being impartial. Now, if this were a class that I were teaching, I would ask my students, who are some people that have commitments to being impartial? Their answers are usually police officers, judges, people that make decisions about the outcome of other people's lives are supposed to be impartial, but we've seen time and time again when they are not. We tend to hold implicit biases that favor our own in-group. Social identity theory states that we just kind of gravitate toward the people that are like us, which creates in-group favoritism, where if we see someone that's like us, we can develop an affinity toward them and develop affinity bias. Now, I would love to know, be able to, again, to ask questions to say, what does that do for someone like me that lives in a community like Ben, where there aren't many people like me? How do I create that sort of favoritism or affinity toward people when there aren't many people that look like me? So consider that as you go about your lives in Central Oregon, that people of color really don't have the same opportunity even to develop friendships or a community. Thankfully, I do have community here and many others do too. And I'm not discounting the large number of other minorities that exist here in Central Oregon. But when you talk about Black folks, I remember when I looked at the census data when I moved here, and it said there were 350 Black people that lived in Bend at the time, and that was 3 years ago. And I moved here and was like, where are they? I don't even know where to find the 350 people. And if I go about my regular workday pre-COVID-19, going to work and home, it would be a while before it can be a while before I see a person of color. It has to be very intentional. So don't take for granted that you can go about your life and see people that look like you on a daily basis. It's pretty isolating when you don't. So who does bias impact the most? This shows, and this chart is from 2015. I did try to find more recent data, but I'm sure it still applies. These statistics are still true and probably even at greater rates now, and probably more so for the Hispanic population, especially since that's the largest minority in the country. So denied a job that you were qualified for, 27% of Black people felt that they were denied a job that they were qualified for, 20% Hispanics and 9% of white people. Denied housing that you could afford, 19% of Black people, 13% of Hispanic people, and 3% of white people. Prevented from voting or has your ballot changed, 5% of Black people, 5% of Hispanic people, and 1% white. Now, we know that's changing. We just saw the results of what happened in Georgia with voter suppression, people having to stand in line for 3 to 4 hours just to be able to vote. And my friends that live in Georgia in the Atlanta area were saying that if you drove out to different areas, the lines were much shorter. It depended on who was voting and where they were voting that determined how long they had to wait to vote. And having that wait was to discourage people from voting. However, people were creative. They had DJs in parking lots and chairs and were offering people food just to wait in line. So count it a blessing if you live in Oregon and you're able to vote by mail. And then people that experienced any of the above, denied a job, denied housing, or prevented from voting, 35% Black people, 26% of the Latinx population, and then 11% of white people, again in 2015. Now, just to be balanced, I was curious if white people felt that they were discriminated against. And according to a poll that was conducted by NPR in 2017, 55% of white people feel that they have been discriminated against when applying for a job, being paid equally, or when applying to college. So I'm not going to delve into why people feel that way, but I also think that now we would see that those statistics have increased as well, of the number of people that feel, number of white people that feel that they've been discriminated against. So what does the research say about our biases, where they come from? Another item that was in the pre-work was the IAT, taking the implicit association tests. And these tests have consistently shown that it takes people milliseconds longer to associate Black faces with positive words, such as good, than with negative words, such as awful. For white faces, the pattern is reversed. The extra time it takes is evidence of someone's implicit bias. So if you took these and you saw that you got results that you were shocked that you favor people that look like you over people that don't be surprised. The test is designed to show you those biases, and we can work on ways to change them. If you were able to beat the test, like my friend Lisa Flexner told me she was able to do, then that means that you were trying very hard to do so. Because if you just take it and follow the instructions without any extra effort, it will show you where your implicit biases are. I have them, and I was surprised to know that even with the amount of work I do in this area, they're still present, and we have to work to get rid of them. Researchers have identified the existence and consequences of implicit bias through well-established methods based upon principles of cognitive psychology that have been developed in nearly a century's worth of work. So implicit bias is real. There is data and science to support that it exists. Now, I will also say that some researchers have problems with the methods around the IAT. However, it certainly does show where our biases are, and the methods around it may be questionable, and scientists can debate that. However, I do believe that it's an effective test just to show you where to start. So where does bias come from? The human mind must think with the aid of categories. Once formed, categories are the basis for normal prejudgment. We cannot possibly avoid this process. Orderly living depends on it. Now, Alport wrote this book back in 1954, and you will get these slides so that you can take advantage of looking up some of these resources and reading them. But back in 1954, we understood that the brain needs to put things in categories. So let's say I'm walking downtown and I'm passing by people as I walk down the sidewalk. I can look at one person and say, okay, female, brown hair, blue eyes. Go to the next person, male, brown hair, dark eyes. The brain needs to do that for some reason. We see things, we have to categorize them, and we keep going. However, in those short periods of time, we can't talk to people and find out what their heritage is. While I might see a white woman with blonde hair and blue eyes walking down the sidewalk, I'm not going to stop her and ask, what's your national origin? What's your ethnicity? Where are you from? What heritage gives you that blonde hair and blue eyes? We just put people in buckets and keep going. Our brains need to do that. However, we need to be careful of the stereotypes that we allow to place people in categories as well. So what causes us to sometimes place people in negative buckets in our mind? It's our biases. And where do they come from? So they tend to come from the influences and experiences we've had in life. So let's say that someone has had a negative experience with a Black person. And so now all Black people are put into that same bucket. We are constantly bombarded with stereotypes in the media. So examples of some stereotypes are white men are smarter and better leaders. I teach leadership at OSU Cascades, and one of the first principles of leadership that were developed, or theories, were the great man theories. And these were men of a certain height, a certain stature, with a certain amount of education, a certain amount of charisma, and they were considered to be great men. And if you want to label people as great men, just think about the presidents that we've had. And especially in the last 3 to 4 elections. And Barack Obama was the one that did not fit the bill in terms of race, but most, all other presidents have been white men that were deemed smart and good leaders. So to break that stereotype shockingly happened in my lifetime. And hopefully we can continue to push against that stereotype, because we all know that, women are smarter. That was a joke. And I can't hear you laughing, so sorry. All Black men are good athletes. So I have a story that goes with this. My son is 14. And when we moved here and he was in middle school, all the coaches wanted him to play sports. And we had agreed that he wouldn't play football, but of course the football coach wanted Brandon to try out for the football team. And I told him, I said, Brandon, and he hadn't played football in a long time. And I said, well, Brandon, they're expecting Russell Wilson, and that's not who you are. So assuming that all Black men are good athletes is based on a stereotype and not a good stereotype to make. Black women are angry or sassy. I said earlier that no one is going to dominate me, so I don't like to use dominant culture. So people might take that as a sassy or angry comment. That's not how I meant it. If you know me at all, that's just fact. So white women are great trophy wives. That is a common stereotype associated with white women. I remember working at the University of Alabama, and I would hear some of the other staff talk about some of the young ladies, like she's here to get her MRS instead of her MBA. So that's a stereotype that impacts white women negatively. We are just as smart and just as capable as men. And if people are there and enrolled in a program, they're there to get a degree and not a spouse. Another common stereotype is all Asians are good at math, or they all know karate or martial arts. And that's not necessarily true either. So being bombarded with those stereotypes in media all the time can cause us to have certain beliefs about groups, especially in a place like Central Oregon, where you're not exposed to anything other than what you see on TV or read in the media. So it takes effort to go beyond the bubble, as we call it, living here, and seeing what people are really and truly like. Make an effort to get to know people. Having a knowledge of real world disparities between groups. Some things are just true and different among groups. There are socioeconomic disparities that exist between some groups. Differences in how we prepare food, or differences in how we take care of our bodies. All of that can be real world knowledge that a person has and can cause you to develop biases. How do we change bias in our minds? How do I overcome the fact that I might prefer a certain one group over another group? It's with our cognitive moral development. So we can change the categories that our minds put people in, or puts people in. It takes time and effort as we are at different stages of moral development. And that influences how we make decisions. If we strengthen our cognitive moral development, we can change how we make decisions. Most people reason at the conventional level and are looking outside themselves for guidance. So if we see where at level 1, that's when we're children, where our moral development is based on obedience and punishment orientation. When we see that what we do pleases our parents, we keep doing that. And if we're punished, if you think about a baby, If they go to reach for an outlet, you tell them no. Well, they know then not to do that anymore, and they want to please you, so they'll be obedient, hopefully. Instrumental purpose and exchange. So when you get a little older and you start going to school and you see other kids doing things that, and you test the boundaries, right, of what's good and what's bad and what you can do and what you can't do. Pre-conventional level. Level 2, where most people are operating, we're operating on interpersonal accord, conformity, and mutual expectations. I mentioned walking downtown. What do people expect me to do as I'm walking? Dancing down the sidewalk will certainly get some attention, but I want to fit in. I want to be a part of the culture that's around me, so I do things the same way that other people do them. And I may just go through life looking through it with system maintenance of upholding duties and laws. I'm going to be a good person doing what I'm supposed to do in society, not challenging the status quo. That's most people. But at level 3, which is post-conventional or principled, you can deviate a little from the social contract and understand that individual rights exist. When I teach this in my ethics classes, I always ask my students, how many of you think differently than your parents about various things, religion, politics, etc.? Many of them always raise their hands that they have different views. So that's challenging that pre-conventional level of moral development, and they're moving into developing their own principled way of thinking about life. So if you think about adding just a few more seconds to processing the buckets that you put people in as you walk down the street, and move past those life experiences that you've had that may be negative, or the stereotypes that you've seen or read about people, and take a little bit longer to put them in a category. This shows that you're moving to that principled level of moral development. So as young professionals or professionals, what can you do in your organizations? There's a lot of literature out there that shows that diversity training just doesn't work in a way that most organizations think it does. So you may remember a few years ago, Starbucks had an incident at one of their stores in Philadelphia where 2 Black men were arrested. As a result of that, the store employee called the police and didn't need to. The men were arrested, and it was just a expensive situation for Starbucks. They decided to close their stores and train everyone on diversity. Well, everyone didn't show that they needed training that day. That was one employee that made a very bad decision. They even had a few other instances of similar situations, but again, 3 to 4 employees doesn't mean your entire organization has a problem. They closed stores, they trained everyone. Well, now Starbucks is in the news again because they didn't allow their employees to support Black Lives Matter by wearing bracelets or t-shirts or anything that said Black Lives Matter. So now, of course, they're ordering, I just saw an article this morning, they are ordering Black Lives Matter t-shirts for their employees that want to wear them. So diversity training certainly has its flaws. Does it help? It helps when people want it. So this training was offered for, many people registered, and 484 of you are here. So you want to learn, you want to be trained. So what I'm saying today will stick with you, and you'll probably seek other resources. I hope you will seek other resources as well to continue your growth. That is when diversity training is effective, when people want it. But what do you do outside of that? To get leaders engaged. So some tools to get your leaders involved is engagement. Allow managers to participate in diversity initiatives and have mentoring programs. So allowing managers to participate in diversity initiatives. One particular article I read talked about allowing managers that maybe didn't support diversity training to participate in college recruiting, to travel to different areas around the country and interact with people and see that it's not that diversity isn't bad. There's so much research that shows the benefit of diversity to organizations and to doing good business. So diversity is needed, but you get people involved in those initiatives and creating those initiatives, and they'll be more invested. Allow managers to mentor diverse employees, diverse students, so that, again, they can just interact, which leads to the second point. It creates contact between groups so that you can see that those stereotypes aren't true, and you can learn and create and work together toward common goals as equals. Then there's social accountability. It plays on our need to look good to people that are around us. Accountability theory states that people are less likely to do things that society deems as bad or unprofessional if they care about how their peers see them. So take advantage of that social accountability. People want to look good in front of their peers. So maybe that's how you can get people involved into and participating in trainings like these. And then diversity managers, diversity coordinators, chief diversity officers, they play important roles in organizations because they keep different topics related to the diversity on the forefront and on the minds of employees at all times. What we're seeing right now is a moment in time. I hope that once the protests stop, that people don't lose focus or engagement in what we're working toward right now. The work isn't going to stop. It's always going to be there. So we have to make sure that we stay steadfast in keeping this on the forefront of people's minds. And within organizations, chief diversity officers, managers, and coordinators help to do that. So ways to identify implicit bias in hiring or in your organization. So in social cognitive theory, human behavior is extensively motivated and regulated by the ongoing exercise of self-influence. These include self-monitoring of one's behavior, its determinants, and its effects. Basically, pay attention to what you're doing, pay attention to what you're saying. Make sure that your bias isn't showing. I see on social media where people can post something and someone will comment, your racism is showing. Well, make sure that your bias isn't showing in what you do and what you say. The ouch test is always applicable in organizations, especially in hiring. Make sure that the process or the questions are objective. This is a part of the ouch test. Make sure that the process and questions are objective, they're fact-based and quantifiable, not subjective or emotional. Especially in the first phase of a hiring process where you just have hundreds of applications, make sure that you're using quantifiable data to weed people out, not subjective or emotional information. Make sure that things are uniform in application. Ask the same questions of all the candidates or apply the test the same way to all the candidates. Make sure they're consistent in effect. Ensure that their result is not significantly different for different groups. An example of this is ACT and SAT scores. Many institutions use those as determining whether or not people can get into college. Well, we know that there are barriers. If you think back to the graphic with the fence, one of the barriers to education for low income people and people of color is not having the resources to study properly for those tests. If you cannot buy books or study books or take a class or something like that to help prepare you, you won't do as well as those students that do have access to those resources. So we have to make sure that processes are consistent in effect, and make sure that the questions that you ask have job relatedness, job or task relatedness. The action must relate to the essential job functions. So normally, when I talk about these cases, again, I'm in a classroom type setting where I can ask a lot of questions and we can have dialogue. But for today, I'm just going to talk to you about the two cases and the reasons why I chose them. When I was asked to do this, I was told that the young professionals wanted to know, what can you do? What can they do? I wrote an opinion piece for the bulletin trying to answer the questions, what can you do? So check that out if you have a chance. But this first case, was that harassment, shows what to do if something happens around you. So the players in that particular case were Jackson, Rayner. They were having the conversation, two young white men, Suzanne, the HR person, and Tiara, who is the African-American or Black employee. The dilemma was that Jackson and Rayner were having a conversation about why the other was selected for a particular program. A comment was made as Tiara walked in the room that she must have been selected because of her good looks. Now, the guys were laughing and joking about it, and when she walked in the room, the comment took on a different meaning because it was stated to her as well. Rayner, who participated in the conversation, was offended and uncomfortable by Jackson's remark and decided to report it to Suzanne in HR. But was that really harassment? If we were in an HR class, we would talk extensively about the situation, but I wanted to use this one to show that if you're offended by something, say something. That we can debate whether or not Rayner should have talked to Tiara before he reported it to HR, but when you see something, say something. If it offends you, you have the right as a person, even if it didn't happen to you, to speak up. The case also mentions several other instances where Jackson had made offensive remarks, so it seemed like taking action with him in turn, not necessarily firing him, but some sort of corrective action would be necessary. Now, with the best of intentions case, this is a case that I talk about in every HR class and most trainings that I do. The players here are Cynthia Mitchell, Peter Jones, and Steve Ripley. Steve, a Black man, has applied for a sales role that would be a promotion within his company. He would report to Cynthia, who reports to Peter. Peter felt that the area that Steve would cover, which was in the South, wouldn't welcome him as their representative because he's Black. Cynthia feels that Steve is the most qualified candidate and doesn't know if she should hire Steve or not. Most commonly, my students all say that she should hire Steve. It's simple. But Cynthia does something that I would not recommend, which is she takes Steve to lunch and tells Steve about the challenges that he might face as a Black man. And she also tells him that that's the reason why, or that they're considering not offering him the job. Now, this case is interesting because, and I almost put the customers that are located in the South as players in this case, because they're not even being asked or considered. Peter is basing his decision about the customer base on stereotypes himself, stereotypes of racism in the South, stereotypes of how people would behave toward a Black man in the South, instead of just talking to the customer base or just hiring Steve and dealing with the customers if there's a problem. But that would create more work for him and for Cynthia. And is that something that they want to take on? And that was my question with Cynthia as well. It would be more work for her, possibly. If there were problems with the customers, it might be more work for her to go out to the area with Steve and just introduce him to the customers. The customers may not have had a problem at all. So they were making assumptions based on stereotypes. And they could have, depending on how Steve handled that conversation with Cynthia opened the door for legal trouble if he did not get the job. So we have to be very careful that we don't make assumptions that disenfranchise people of color. So I probably went through that very fast because I'm nervous, but now we are going to get into questions, which I always find to be the most valuable part of the conversation. But thank you for listening today. Thank you for registering for this very important training. And I hope that you keep your knowledge, that you keep pursuing knowledge in this area.
Jeff, this is time for you to go ahead and unmute and turn your video on. Thank you.
Okay, I'm right here. Thank you. Okay, well, Erica, thank you so much for that. I apologize, everybody. My computer and my camera froze and it would not let me turn it back on. So I had the little spinning thing. It was going, and it finally came off. So we're good again. I love technology. I love my internet. I love when my children must be doing 1,000 things right now on it while I'm trying to do this. Erica, thank you again. That was incredible, an amazing training. Thank you for the information that you shared with the group. Sincerely appreciate it. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to take a moment to introduce the two panelists that will be joining you for the follow-up Q&A, if that sounds good. So I'm going to start off with Marcus Legrand. So Marcus is on, there he is. Hey, Marcus. Marcus Legrand is one part educator, 2-part student advocate, tremendously human-centric, but currently is trying to be present in today's world. His pronouns are he and they, works at Central Oregon Community College, father of 2, loving husband, and passionate for change. Marcus, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome,
Along
Jeff.
with Marcus, we also have Anissa Bohannon. Anissa, do you want to turn your video on as well? Awesome. Hey, Anissa, welcome. Anissa has been a reporter and anchor with Central Oregon Daily News in Bend for the last 4 years. She also gave a TED Talk at TEDx Bend in 2017 and frequently speaks to various groups about her experiences as a woman of color across Central Oregon. Anissa, thank you.
Thanks for having
joining
me.
us today. So what I wanted to do, and I think this is an important thing to kind of start off with, and feel ties in really well with Erica, with how you sort of ended that training and some of the issues that you talked about. A question that I think might be on a lot of folks' minds, and it kind of also goes back to some of the terms that you started off with. I wanted to ask this question, and not just for you, Erica, but also Marcus and Anissa. And we'll start with you, Erica, and then we'll jump to Marcus, and we'll finish off with Anissa. I'd like you to each answer, what does allyship look like to you?
To me, allyship is showing up when it matters the most. I can't tell you the number of friends and colleagues that I've had to reach out to me during these times of racial unrest in our country, and it has meant so very much. I didn't know I needed it until it started coming in, and I really, really appreciated that. So showing up, not only that, listening to us when we need you to, and all the time, listening to our thoughts. I said before, I think the quote that I posted with this advertisement was that if you don't have a person of color at your table as a part of conversations related to your organization or your community, then you're missing the mark. You can't say that you care about people of color or that you care about issues that impact people of color if you're not hearing from people of color. So allyship with action behind it is what I need to see.
And to piggyback what Erica just said, I think they're very intertwined. I love what she said about you definitely got to make sure that you're listening. But the thing I want you to do also is be present. be vulnerable to what's going on. Like she said, look inside your organizations, look at your environment, look at some of your church groups, your board of directors, and look at some of those organizations. If they're not diverse, find a way to make them diverse. And you'll find a cool way to be able to make sure that happens. Secondly, stop apologizing. Okay, we want to see you take action. Remember that policy change and cultural change are two different things, as mentioned in the case study, The Best Intentions. I believe it was Sarah Billieu who said that. We got to look at changing the culture versus changing the policy, because if you do that, it will definitely it will happen. Third, don't bog down all the minorities in your organization. It's not their problem to fix, it's yours. So you have to look within yourself and inside your organization on how those things can happen. And then mostly, like I said, don't hide behind your titles. Use your titles to make actual change.
Absolutely. Obviously, Erica and Marcus said all of the things that I wanted to, because they're amazing. But I think to add to that, educating yourself, not having to go to your friends who are of color and say, hey, what should I do here? What do I need to make sure that I'm a better ally? I have found that those people who have reached out to me after they did the work of reading or researching or looking things up, and then coming and saying, hey, I understand or empathize a lot more with this now, has been incredibly helpful. And to speak up, use your voice. Even don't just let this movement be a hashtag for you. Don't let this just be something that, you want to show on social media your support. Do that offline too.
Jeff, can I just add one more comment?
Absolutely.
Woke culture can be dangerous. So as you are reading and learning, that is phenomenal. But please don't think you know more about me or know more about being Black than I do because you've read a few books. You will never, ever, ever have our lived experience. So please know that, and don't become dangerous because you've read a few books. Don't do harm to us because you're trying to learn about us.
Thank you. Thank you all for that. I'm going to start with the next question I have is I think it's an important one, and one that Erica, I know you touched on in your presentation, also in the amazing editorial that came out in the Bend Bulletin today. Just want to give a for that. And I'm going to actually start though with you, Anissa, with this question, if that's all right. And I'm going to frame it in just very briefly and then turn it over to you. So one of the questions that I'm sure you all have heard, I've heard, I know a lot of us have heard in just general conversations, is at this time of pain, at this time of wanting change, folks are trying to understand what they can do. And that's, there's a whole realm of what that means. But I thought what would be very helpful to sort of answer, and I know some of the questions in the Q&A that have been asked already tie to this. What are things that folks can do to really help make that change, to move that dial long term? I'll start with you, Anissa.
I think the easiest way to go about it, to at least start, is just to have the conversation. Obviously, discussions about racism are uncomfortable, but I have them every single day. And I know a lot of my other friends of color and the people that I know also have them. And it's very important that it's not just us having that conversation. It's important that other groups also have that discussion. I think that's just kind of the stepping stone, the jumping off point for sure, outside of, obviously reading books and etc.
Okay. Marcus.
In terms of systems within different organizations, I think the hardest thing is that when we look at most companies, we know how they're structured hierarchically. I think that's the wrong word. I want to make sure I say it correctly. But from a hierarchical standpoint, look at those companies and how they go across. What do you see within those? If you see white male, white male, white male, white male, white male, who's in VP, CEO, whatever, and then the mid-level managers are either a mix of whatever, and then the workers are pretty much people of colors, whatever. That lets you know that there's no diversity of ideas. How do you get those people who work within those organizations at those lower levels to come up and be a part of the decision making? You got to make sure that happens. When we say truly do it, just don't do it as a one-off. Actually make it sure it's continually happen on a consistent basis. And like Erica mentioned in her presentation, you got to be able to address those things right away when you see them happen, and not just talk about them, actually put things into place that changes the culture. And I see it in the school systems all the time. We have a lot of people, 80% of the teachers are women, 20% of the, and 80% of the administrators are male. So that's kind of, a little skewed in terms of looking at the dynamics. How can we fix those things? Make sure that those people are not only, one, being held accountable, but then two, make sure that you're working with them to make household changes so they'll be successful. So different people from different backgrounds can be engaged in the various situations.
I've already said what people can do multiple times in multiple ways, so I don't have anything to add.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to jump back, Anissa, to something you said and just open this up to everyone. So, and this came up before too, having a conversation. I'm going to just say for myself, I really appreciate that point, opening that idea, having a conversation. I will say for myself, and I know this for others, depending on what the conversation is, who I'm trying to have the conversation with, making sure that I'm expressing things that are genuine, making sure that I'm expressing things that are respectful, making sure I'm asking the right questions, and showing that I'm listening and understanding. These are all things that I think of very intentionally when I have some of these conversations. And so what would be helpful, I think, to me, and for some of the questions on the side, and I'll open this to any of you, is talk to me a little bit more, maybe talk a little bit more about what that conversation is. What is the conversation that you hope folks will have, and what are the questions that you hope folks will answer, maybe either asking you or answer for themselves? I think that might be helpful to give a little bit more info on that if you'd be willing.
Sure. And I don't just mean conversations with your friends of color. I mean, conversations with your Caucasian family members, with, your friend who is, has that one Black friend and so can't be racist. It's important to have those conversations, not just with us, because again, we've already had these conversations, but to acknowledge that it's a problem and maybe talk with other people about, the privileges that you might have, the systemic racism that might be going on. And then that will help it to acknowledge, even your biases, which we all have, obviously. It will help to kind of open up both of your minds at that point, or everyone's mind, I feel like. So in terms of, how to start that conversation, I mean, turn on the news at any point and say, hey, look, this is another thing that's going on. And you can springboard off of that, whatever might be happening. So, I understand that it can be difficult for sure, especially with some people's family members, to bring up certain topics, especially things like race, when they might not be open to it. But if you truly would like to be an ally and see changes, then those are the people that we need to be reaching.
I agree. Start at home, having these conversations. Have them with your spouse or significant other, if you have one. Have them with your friends. Have them with your children, please. If you were, and I've said this too, if you were offended by the murder of George Floyd, talk about it with your family so that my Black son doesn't have to explain to your white son what it's like or why or how, Black people are feeling. Children shouldn't have to bear that weight. And I'm so thankful that they've been out of school during this ordeal so that he doesn't have to carry that weight. I'm an adult. I choose to do the work that I do, but my son doesn't have a choice when he's thrust into the spotlight. So just please have these conversations amongst yourself, have that dialogue around the dinner table. Talk about privilege so that it's no longer a trigger word. Talk about whiteness. Talk about being white. Say the word white so that it's not a trigger word. And just learn how to embrace different cultures, different heritage among your family first. If you start there, then what happens outside, that's a way to truly make a difference or have an impact on racism.
And I would definitely like to say to those parents who have those kids, listen to them, because we know there's a many household out here who are a lot of students who would love to be protesting or say something, but like Erica talked about in her training, a lot of those kids are not going to be able to look at that authority figure and go, hey, my mom and dad are who are the breadwinners. They're not going to let me be able to go do that because they think differently than I do. So make sure that you understand that those kids' conversations are golden, because then you get to really figure out who your kids are.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing. So one of the questions from one of the participants stated this. They said that, Erica, in your presentation, you stated that we should use quantitative, objective factors to narrow down the subject pool for a position. They also mentioned, though, that then you talked about the issue that SAT scores are biased against people of color and socioeconomic factors. And so their question really is how we can align the two. And I have that, Marcus, you put a comment in there too, so I'll defer. Marcus, if you or Erica would like to take that one first.
Go ahead, Erica. I was just letting them know that you would do it live.
Okay, thank you. Hey, Dina. Dina is my colleague. She asked that question. I will say that when people apply for job postings, the posting needs to be written in such a way that it's all inclusive, first of all. We can't do anything as organizations about the qualifications that people have for a position. So let's just say a college degree is required. Well, that limits your pool right there. There's nothing that we can do about that. However, when we sit down to review those applications, we need to keep in the back of our minds that not everybody was able to go to Harvard. Not everybody went to Yale. And we can make better decisions using that data. Just saying a college degree is required and not an Ivy League education is required. So that's one way to distinguish between the two. And just, yeah, that's just really it. That's one way, that's an example. But just making sure that your postings are inclusive and don't exclude a majority, don't exclude minorities from the pool.
Okay, thank you. One of the questions that one of the attendees put forth that I think is a good question to ask this group and maybe start a little bit of a dialogue. The question is, what are some of the unique challenges that you all might be able to talk to or reference for the people of mixed race in terms of dealing with? And some of those perspectives and thoughts, just, I'm going to frame that, that's the question that was asked, but I'm going to kind of let you all sort of answer that in how you feel most appropriate. Marcus, maybe we can start with you since I see you're off mute.
Oh, okay. In terms of mixed race, because I have mixed race kids, that is a delicate conversation. It is. It's tough. I know I'm African American or Black or whatever you would like to use, and I know my wife is white, and we have to have those hard conversations. They're going to be a little bit different. I have to have those hard conversations with their friends and their families. Do you understand that if you're going to be friends with my kid, and if when they become older in driving age, if they're out, what are you teaching them? What are you talking to them about? Are you encouraging them to have those conversations, or all of a sudden you're going to separate from them and not be their friends anymore? Or are you going to stand by and hear people say racist things or, improper things? Or are you going to engage to make sure that they feel safe with your friendship? So I have to have those conversations all the time. But the main thing I really try to do is educate both sides. I show my kids a lot of things about the past and try to show them how it's relevant to now. And also I basically show them, hey, here's what's going on. So I think it's tough, but at the same time, too long as you, like you said, I take the time to nurture their education, I think it's going to be perfect. It's going to be fine. Now, in terms of students who live here in Central Oregon, unfortunately, many of them either adopted or mixed race, or they just happen to grow up here. And we understand that right now, currently, we do not have a African-American or person of color type of curriculum in our schools. It's not mandated. So if we can start teaching students how to be able to have that information, to how to utilize it to make better decisions, then they'll be a little bit more sensitive, or I say empathize with what's going on with many of the students of color. So take the time to can educate your kids on those things. Yes, they're mixed race, but at the same time too, know they're still human beings.
I would just say, from the standpoint of families that have adopted children of color, try your best to educate that child about their culture, where they came from, who they are, so that they have an understanding, because I'm sure that that's confusing, especially if they live here in Bend, to be in such a homogenous community, and they go to school and they're so very different, but they go home and they're also different. So just keep in mind that excellent mental health resources exist for children that are adopted by white families that are of color, and just take advantage of those. And there's no harm in teaching that child about where they came from and the culture that they have.
Sorry, I have nothing to add because I don't necessarily have that experience.
So one of the things I thought would be a topic, there's several questions that sort of get at this. So I'm going to try to take a few of them, summarize, and then pass that back out to you. And I see Anissa's off of mute, so I'm going to pick on her to be the one to answer this. Sorry, leave that off. That's fair game. There's a lot of questions that I'm seeing in the feed, and I'm going to try to summarize them the best I can and use the questions that people are asking so that they get the answer they want. But in general, the questions that they're being asked are, how do we avoid tokenism? How do we avoid a situation where in the current environment, if we are asking folks to join our boards or our organizations or reaching out to people, that they understand that it's genuine? One of the questions is, how do you balance wanting to make friends with people of color or diverse people without tokenizing or trying to meet them just because they appear to be a diverse person? How do I avoid this when trying to diversify my organization? So there's several questions about this, and I thought that these definitely seem to be on the front of people's minds. So I wanted to ask you on, and then this, if you don't mind, I'd just like to jump and start with you.
Sure, I think that's a great question. Honestly, I don't necessarily have an answer. You know, if it's in terms of an organization and you're looking for other people of color, but you only know one person, you know, I would recommend reaching out to other diverse groups, because there are many of them here in Central Oregon that you can reach out to and ask them for resources. There's obviously going to be a lot of qualified people there as well. In terms of friendships, those are a little more organic. And I understand that people don't want to come across as like, I want to be your friend because you're Black. And if it is genuine, I'm going to feel that, like I'm going to understand that. And I think that, in terms of making sure that I'm not the only one in the group, it's probably going to be a little bit inevitable here. And I think that just recognizing that and not just kind of pinpointing those differences maybe all the time in your friendships and your relationships is important, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would rather you just want to be my friend because I'm Erica, not because I'm Black. Because you'll get bored real fast. I mean, I'm not gonna want to talk about my Blackness all the time. It's not something I think about every second of the day. So I would suggest just getting to know people for who they are, not because you want to diversify your friend group. Also with board service, I can speak to that. There are so many capable, talented people of color in Central Oregon. I know that I'm the only Black person at OSU Cascades. Yes, but please don't ask me. I am tapped out in terms of board service. But I will say that I can recommend someone else, to be on your board. And I think that that's what we have to do, right? If you know me and you want to, or you want to just email me and say, hey, I heard you say that you're maxed out on board service, but do you know someone else that we could talk to? Then yeah, definitely. That's why I'm doing Love Your Neighbor, just to show this community that there are other people of color that exist in this region, and call on them, ask them, because their voices are important too. As I started out with, I'm not the representative for everybody Black. The three of us that are here today have different opinions on different things. So it's not like I can just be the one representative for everyone. I don't want that responsibility. I only want to speak for myself. So I think that it's great to reach out to other people and say, who else do you know? Who else can we talk to?
And to piggyback on that, do your due diligence. Figure out who people are. Find out what stuff they're involved in. Find out if it meets the scope of your organization, because you still want to vet and find out exactly what's going on too. I mean, they're still professionals. You want to make sure that their ideals align with yours, just like you would do anyone else. But the thing I don't want it to be an afterthought. Okay. I don't want it to be a reactionary thing because we're currently in this situation. Make sure it's genuine, and we can read through the BS, unfortunately. So make sure that you know those things. Okay. So like I said, we're willing to help. We want to see change too, but do it from an organic standpoint. Like Anissa said, do it in a way where we feel like, hey, you know what? They really genuinely are trying to make household changes, and make sure, we're part of that.
I just want Erica to know that she is far from the most boring person I've ever met in my life. So just in case you guys are wondering, she's amazing.
Thank you.
I think we can safely say that all three of you are amazing. I'm going to go out and say that. So another question from the folks over here in the Q&A, and I'm going to start off with you, Erica, because this one is directed towards your presentation, but I think it'll open up an opportunity for Marcus and Anissa to respond. So someone noticed that in the glossary terms that you started off with, which again was awesome, that you didn't actually, they didn't notice diversity. So it wasn't actually defined, and they would love to know how you define it. And then I would appreciate, on top of you, Marcus and Anissa's sort of perspective. So, but I'll start with you, Erica.
Okay. Normally, when I do this training, diversity is on the list. However, I removed it for the sake of time. This is a training that I normally do that takes 3 hours. So I had to cut it down to 55 minutes. So I had to get some stuff off of there. But diversity is a range of races, ethnicities, sexual orientation, diversity of thought, just a mix of opinions. When you hear the word homogeneous, that means the same. You don't want that in your organization. You want people to bring diverse ideas to the table. You want people that will change the status quo. So that's what diversity means to me. Marcus or Anissa might have a different definition.
To piggyback on what she's saying, students, use them. That's diverse. Their ideas, they're going to be the representatives of this community. Reach out to them, find out what they want. You'll be amazed at what a 14, 15, 16-year-old kid can tell you, or student can tell you about what's going on in their lives and how it impacts them. Make sure that they know how the systems work within here. That's diverse too. Teach them how the systems work within a community organization so they know how to benefit from those things. Diversity to me means bring interns who are diverse across the board. So there's just so many different things that we can do to make sure that we educate and make sure it's very engaging, and the culture will change. I know Eric always tells me about this. I always talk about if you take away this, I always talk about if you take away the spice and all the food and different stuff around here, guess what you have? You just have regular food. So we're the spice. We're the people who basically bring a lot of that to this. We bring a different perspective. And that's what we love. And it's always jovial and it's very communal. And that's what we would love to see. So that's what diversity means to me.
Yeah, both of those things ring true for me as well, but also diversity in the education, like you were saying. I don't want to just hear about the slave trade. I want to hear about other Black people who did other things. I want to hear about other people of color who have done wonderful things, for this nation, for their city, for just their communities, so diversity for me is definitely a diversity of thinking as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question, and I'm just going to let whoever would like to take this first. And I think this is a good question to maybe lead into some other topics. So one of the attendees posted this, and I'm just going to read it as it says because I think it's good. An argument I hear a lot when it comes to racism and bias in regards to our generations, and they're specifically referencing older generations, but I'm just going to reference the generations, is that it is simply how they were raised and or a sign of the times. Like it should negate the impact of the statements they've made. Do you have advice on how to handle these types of interactions? And I'm assuming they're talking about it in the work world, but I'm going to check that assumption and say just in general, how do folks address this when they handle these types of situations or interactions? And I'll let whoever would like to start.
I will say that I won't say I'm triggered by that question, but it certainly brings up some emotion in that anybody can change. And racism, specifically Black people being treated less than, has been going on for centuries. People have been fighting against it at least for the last 100 years. So in my mind, there's no excuse. If you are accepting racism in any way, as how you were raised, or is that's just how so-and-so is, that's not an excuse. You can do better. People can be better. We have to try to be. It takes effort and it takes hard work, but just resting on that's how I was raised is not an excuse.
Yeah. Racism was the same in 1930 as it is in 2020. So call them out.
For me with that, we know that, and we have data out there that states that racism is something that's learned. It's taught, is portrayed in the different mediums. We just have to call it what it is. We just have to definitely step up and step out of your bubble and just say something. You know it when it happens, but unfortunately, a lot of people are afraid to step out on faith that they're gonna feel ostracized if they decide to say something. That shouldn't be the case. These are human beings. I think that's why I always go with the humanistic approach. If you look everyone as a human being and what they bring to the table, then guess what? You eliminate a lot of the other things. Okay. But look at them as a human first. So then we don't have to have those conversations. We can basically just be who we are. So that's just me. I just want people to feel like they matter.
And I just also want to say we're human. We are not, when we're referred to as tokens, a token is a thing. I'm a human being. I'm a person. And to think that I don't deserve to be treated the same as a white woman that also has everything equal to me is disappointing. However, that's how this society was built. And we have to come to a place in the United States where we are tired of race being such a huge divider in our country. When we had, whether or not you agree, but it was proven that there was hacking in terms of social media and everything with the last election. And most of that propaganda was race-based. And it's because other countries can see what race arguments do to the United States. And when are we as a country and as a people going to be tired of that? We're smarter than that. We're supposed to be the best nation on the planet. So when are we going to be tired of being manipulated and played based on race? we have to put our foots down at some point and say, we're going to stop.
Thank you all. I want to take a step back just 1 second to something that Marcus said about when you see something, you say something. And I think I just want to make sure that as somebody who does and has been part of the diversity change agent program for my own agency, has been involved in, a variety of things to help spread the word of importance. Oh, and I'm just going to share this going back to some of the other questions. For anybody out there right now that has that question in your brain still of what can you do at any given time, on any given day, in any given situation, if you see something, you have the opportunity to say something, even if it's small, you have to do it. And I say that I'm going to try to summarize these really quick into one statement that you all can answer for us and help us understand. And that is, and this is something I think a lot of us are trying to deal with right now, and it's a sort of a two-part process. One, how do we, in our organizations, I'm going to talk about it in our offices right now. We'll step out of the social realm for a second and just talk about the work, because there's a lot of work type questions on the side here. How do we create that safe space in our offices to have these conversations? And more specifically, because there are a couple of questions about this on the side, how do we engage our leadership in our organizations to get them to open up and have these conversations? I think these are two things that folks are really focused on right now, and I would love to hear some of the perspectives from any of you on that.
All right, I'll go first on this. For me, I know you're asking us to help you with your organization. You work for that organization. Take the time as a collective, go to your management, go to your leaders in those organizations saying, hey, you know what? I don't know how to approach this. Be vulnerable. Hey, we need to figure out how we can make this more comfortable for people of color wanting to be here and work for these organizations. You got to just have those hard conversations. I know it may hurt your gut, but you got to do it. But you got to just be that one person who continues to give other people and galvanize them to make them feel like they can do that and feel like their voices are being heard. Because if you don't, then it's just going to be the status quo and nothing's going to change. You got to do the due diligence, and you do your due diligence and make sure that those things happen. Because if you don't, then you're going to continue to have the same thing over and over again. And you really shouldn't have that.
I can help with your organization, but you got to pay me. And I say that because often the expertise that we bring to the table, people ask questions because my skin is brown, but I also have a certain level of expertise that I bring to the table. So I can help with organizational issues. I can help you make your organization more inclusive. I can help you do all those things. But if you're willing to pay a white consultant to come in and do those things, then please pay us equally for our talents as well.
And that's a word. That's all that needs to be said.
So some of the questions, and thank you all for that. That was awesome. There's a lot of questions on the side about talking to our children. And Eric, I want to go back. You made gave a very profound perspective before about children in the school, your son, and thankful that the kids aren't in school right now so that he's not expected to have to answer all those questions. There are questions on the side though. Folks are interested, and maybe you can help us with this. There's a sort of a two-part, so I'll give both together and then let you guys jump in what portion you would like. And this is probably going to be our last question today, but I'm going to go back to what Marcus said about including our students and the youth as our future. So I want to end with this question because I think it's really critical. The first is engaging children in these conversations. What are some of the things you would suggest? And then also, because we clearly have some teachers in the audience, and I think it's important to answer their questions, how do we best develop a curriculum, or provide some input into curriculums, or develop some pieces of our curriculum that can also engage these conversations with youth? So I'm going to just leave those two sort of together, but hand them back out to you.
Yeah. I'm going to let Marcus address the curriculum piece, but I will say this as the mother of a Black child in the K through 12 system here in Bend. Please don't discount our Black children or our children of color because they are not the majority. I've heard often, but I only have 12 African-American students in the school. Okay, you have 12. You know, that means you have to pay attention to those 12, even though, because I guarantee if something happens with my one, there will be a revolution. So I just think that we cannot ignore children of color here because they are such a minority. Their needs are still important. Their mental health is so important. And I might cry here, but my son wrote a paper or did a presentation, and the title of it was, "Why is it so hard being a Black kid?" And for him, at 14 years old, to have that experience, it makes me wonder, you know, and I ask him all the time, "Are you okay? Is school going good? Do you have friends? Is everything going good?" And he tells me all the time, yes, yes, yes. He doesn't want to move. He doesn't want this and that. But it still pains me that he has to consider his race at all. And so many children get to go to school every day and not have to consider the color of their skin. And so teachers, administrators, please pay attention to your children of color, especially in these types of environments. I saw a question from Christy Gomez. I went to high school with Christy, so I want to say, hey, girl. And I also want to say, if your district doesn't have a diversity officer of any kind, that's something you should ask for. There should be someone that can give you some resources in your area, in your district, to help educate children about these issues that impact people of color.
And to piggyback what Eric is saying, there is many states in our union that actually have it mandated where African-American literature needs or curriculum needs to be taught. I think New Jersey is one of them, Maryland's one of them as well. New Jersey has a great program with Dr. Keisha Porcher. She's awesome. She talks about teaching matters and how to teach to kids of color. So if you want to look that up, be awesome. Stanford just put out a news report, and I have it in the list of resources that I gave you guys too. Also, there's a Netflix special currently right now. It's called Black, White, and Us, where in Utah, they adopted a lot of Black kids, and they're having racial concerns because most of them are affluent. The families are, but the kids, you know, they're all adopted. So it gives a whole dynamic of how to have those conversations. Teachers, if you do know resources out here in the community like myself, and you want us to come and talk about those things, I have the willingness to do so. But like Eric said, hey, it's going to cost you some money. I can teach you all those things because I work with them. The 1619 project has a curriculum from the New York Times. They have a full base curriculum of how you can implement it into your curriculum as well. So there's books, there's for kids all ages, K through 12, that you can utilize too. I put a list of those also in some of the resources that I had too. So if you feel like you want to know more, we'll definitely come and talk to you about those things. But like I said, I can hopefully help you make sure you make the right decisions and what information is necessary for your school.
I am not a parent, but the amount of friends that I have who do have children in the K through 12 system who are of color, who say that their child is being bullied or called names because of their race is kind of extraordinary. It's a lot of people. And so I think where it needs to begin, going back to that discussion that you need to have at home, you need to talk to your kids about discrimination, why it's not okay, even if it's as simple as you need to not bully people based on the color of their skin or where they're from. That's incredibly important. And they're going to remember that going forward. What they do with that information is up to them. But as a parent, just like it was up to my parents to teach me about discrimination and that someone was going to likely hate me at some point because I am Black, it's up to you guys to teach them that as well.
So we're out of time today. I would love to keep having this conversation, but we are out of time. And so what I want to do is, number one, thank our amazing panelists, Erica, Marcus, and Anissa. Thank you so much for your time, for your transparency, all that. Marcus, you have something you wanted to share real quick? You're on mute.
Thank you. The one thing I want everyone, if they don't take anything from this, Erica, thank you, by the way. Phenomenal job. Thank you very much for all that you do. But the one thing I want everyone to take away from this, nurture your relationships. Nurture relationships. If you can do anything, look outside your bubble, look outside your circle. My mentor told me a long time ago, if you're the smartest person in your group, guess what? It's time to get a new group. Okay, so look around you and find out what's out there so you can definitely have diversity of ideas, because we're all different in terms of the way we approach things, but just do that. Nurture relationships that you do have.
And Jeff, if I could just add really quickly, for all of you that have submitted questions that we didn't get to, we will be going over these questions and we will provide answers in writing. So please don't feel that you were overlooked or ignored today. We will answer your question.
Okay, thank you all. As Erica mentioned, there's going to be a follow-up. We're going to have a follow-up email. The recording will be on the Chamber website, YouTube channel by the end of the day. And we're going to be answering your questions. So I'm going to just close with this last statement and say thank you. In closing, thank you all for participating. You and your daily lives have the power to make change. So I want to make sure you all walk away with that understanding. Be the change you wish to see. Make a difference and share the knowledge you learned today. That's important. We've learned things, share this knowledge. On behalf of our amazing speakers, the Ben Chamber, Ben Young Professionals, and I3, thank you. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you all.